Thank you, Brandon. Again, really excited to be here tonight. So we're going to get into, just jump right in. Is social justice the same as biblical justice? And I'd like to just say, short of it is yes and no. And it really depends, the yes and the no really depends on our definitions. It really depends on our focus regarding social justice. However, what I'm going to be doing is really focusing on sort of a more contemporary emphasis on social justice. And in this case, then, for the most part, I'm going to say no. That the contemporary framework for social justice and its comparative, biblical justice, they're not on the same page. They're not on the same page. We're going to start with asking a question. What kind of thing is justice? It might seem like a really weird question, but in really getting into this, we have to understand that justice means something. We are dealing with either a construct, something that's based straight out of our mind, something that we have pulled together, a definition that is sociologically derived. It's construct. I mean, we have constructs all the time, and I'm not saying that constructs by themselves are bad, but what I am saying is it a construct? Is it just a subjective, interpretive construct? And those three words I want to get into. So subjective means, again, it's something that I see and I understand, and yet you may not agree with me on that. It is my opinion, it is my assessment, and it may not actually line up with fact. It may not line up with fact. It may not line up with the reality of the external world I live in. So subjective is a loaded word too, because it has different connotations in different settings. But the way I'm going to use it today, so as you think about this, make sure you understand how I'm using the word subjective is part of my personal experience of looking at the world, believing I can understand it to an extent, and that I can perhaps understand things as they are outside of me, and from that, pull together a definition of what a thing might be. That doesn't mean, however, it's an absolute objective reality. You might say, well, what in the world are we doing now? Well, the contrast is an objective reality is I am standing on this platform. It is not an opinion. This is something that is real, and it is something you see. If you were to be in my place, it would do exactly the same thing it's doing for me. It's an objective reality. It's something we can all agree on. We might disagree on the color scheme. As you know, if you've gone on social media over the several years, people are arguing over what a color is on a certain item, and we all can't seem to agree, and that's not what we're doing here. Is it merely, let me ask the second question, is justice then just a subjective interpretive construct, or is it objective? Is it merely an instanced in a particular person? Is justice something that's instanced in a person? And what I mean by that is, going back to our previous talk about nominalism, where there are no transcendent essences that we can all share. There's one essence, and we can share it, all of us, the same numeric weight or value. On nominalism, we cannot. We cannot share. We all have instanced or particular instances of a particular value of varying weight or numeric value for each person who experiences it. So is justice that? Is it just a personal or a instant where we see justice at work or at play? Is it just something we're going to name justice, but it just is that particular experience? Again, that's very subjective. Is it merely instanced in a particular person's behavior? So it's kind of what I just said. But the contrast is, some people see that a person can be just. Others would argue a person cannot be just. They can just do just things. So there is this contrast there. I want to make sure you understand that. Is justice a shareable, transcendent essence? Which, if you already know where I'm coming from, you'll know that I would say yes, it is. But moving on to nominalism itself, when we look at justice from this perspective, and remember, nominalism is fundamental to Marxism, it's fundamental to empiricism, it's fundamental to naturalism, and therefore it's a leg, and a significant leg, to critical race theory, critical theory, and even intersectionality. On nominalism, justice is just subjective, and it's interpretive, and it's a construct. Because it's a construct, it's not real. It only matters to the person who has constructed the idea. It's only true to the person who's constructed the idea. So it's subjective. And because it's interpreted, and you have to appreciate how interpretation is viewed and valued in this kind of mental space. Interpretation means, getting back to a philosopher by the name of Immanuel Kant. Immanuel Kant said, I can know a phenomenon, I could see a phenomenon, but I cannot truly know it. I cannot truly know it's, he would use the word nomen. I cannot truly know something within itself. It may exist, it may totally exist, but I can't know it. I can only understand what I interpret. Kant has influenced the entire discussion of interpretation. But here's a problem. If I see, for example, this chair that's next to me over here, I go, I'm interpreting what I see. Now that I have my interpretation, I'm now thinking about my interpretation. Well, guess what happens next? On this view that interpretations are subjective, I have to now appreciate my interpretation, and I've now just created another interpretation of my interpretation. Kantian epistemic knowledge pushes you further back. It's almost like a regression that never stops, to the point that you'll never know something within itself. Now, you may not think on those terms, but the short of that is this. There is this chair. On realism, there is this chair, and it's there, it's real, I'll sit on it, it's great, wonderful. But under Kantian's skepticism of knowing something in itself, I'll never know what this chair really is. Isn't that a sad and tragic way of looking at the world? And yet that is the skepticism baked into the cake of a lot of our modern approaches to values and ethics, knowledge. And it has provided the skepticism upon which relativism lives. It has provided the fertile ground where our postmodern world thrives. Justice on those merits is just a personal, subjective, interpreted construct. On nominalism, it is merely an instanced thing in a person, a particular person. So that means if you were a person who believed that an essence like justice could exist, as a virtue in a person, then it would just only be in that person. And it may be instanced in another person, but the two are not the same. And I know I sound redundant, but it's really important that I am. It's really important that I am. But the weight or the numeric value of each essence of justice is not the same. So you can actually pick whose justice is more weighty. You can actually kind of, not pick, but you can almost understand that there is no single universal standard. Universals are out. Subjectivism is in. Justice on nominalism could be instanced in behavior, but only so long as that behavior continues to occur. But guess what? And it's only instanced in that particular person's behavior. It will appear differently or have a different weight in another person's instance behavior. You might really be scratching your head right now. Trust me, so have I been. And it's really one of those amazing things that you go, people really believe this. And I'm not making fun of the philosophical world on this. I'm saying I understand the thought process and I appreciate working through these things. These are really deep, what might be called metaphysical issues. And yet, the practical implications for that is entirely overwhelming. Justice on nominalism, on Marxism, on these theories make it such that it's not a universal, it is not a universal at all. It is a particular thing that exists. So you can have a justice experience and you can be doing justice, but your actions or your experience or your sense, they're not the same. You cannot share injustice as a thing within itself because it only materializes in the individual. It is not a universal shared experience. Now, getting to this question about intersectionality, let me say one more thing here. On theories like nominalism, empiricism, materialism, Marxism, critical theory, and all the other ones, it is strictly tied. Modern, contemporary social justice is strongly tied to people who are in groups of conflict within a society, in a culture. That is the framework of Marxism. It has merged and become a very different baby. Marxism has become something else, and it has been used and mutated, essentially, in these other ways or prisms to look at society. Intersectionality, then, has helped quantify or at least isolate different instances of injustice. So it goes down to, what is your race, your ethnicity, your socioeconomical background, your biography, your history. There are numerous factors. The quote-unquote calculus of intersectionality is part of modern social justice. I took this from the Center for Intersectional Justice. It's online, you can look it up, but listen to this. What is intersectionality? This is what they told me. And here's a quote, and I have a full quote for you in a moment here, but the concept of intersectionality describes the ways in which systems of inequality based on gender, race, ethnicity, sexual orientation, gender identity, disability, class, and other forms of discrimination intersect to create unique dynamics and effects. I'm gonna let you look at this for a minute. Just pour over those words again. Notice how many categories, and then it goes on and says, and other forms. Well, what other forms? As many forms as you need. Or that might be instanced in terms of new forms of oppression, new forms of discrimination, new forms of identities, new forms of instances on this grid. And all of them then can make a claim toward injustice, oppression, some sort of system that they must overthrow in order to experience equity or equality. And those words are loaded by themselves from a sociological perspective about equity, equality, and other ways of sharing into the value of a workplace in a given society, but we're not going to get into that. The next slide is the full quote. And let me add here from what I read here, because they give you an example. For example, when a Muslim woman wearing hijab is being discriminated, it would be impossible to dissociate her female form from her Muslim identity and to isolate the dimensions causing her discrimination. All forms of inequality are mutually reinforcing and must therefore be analyzed and addressed simultaneously to prevent one form of inequality from reinforcing another form. For example, tackling the gender pay gap alone without including other dimensions such as race, socioeconomic status, and immigration status will likely reinforce inequalities among women. So in other words, you can't just say there's a gender pay gap. You have to say there's a gender, transgender, there is, a black, there's African American, there's Hispanic American, there's Asian American. You have to keep adding and stacking the deck, so to speak. You have to keep stacking the profile in order to illustrate a particular instanced discrimination. So can you imagine? And here's one of my critiques about this, my concern. Where is the terminus? Where is the drop? Where's the bottom of this? Theoretically, on intersectionality, there is never going to be a bottom. There will always be a intersectional instance popped up that we haven't addressed, because we can just keep adding. This is an indefinite mentality. Again, remember, because all of these things are instanced, they're particular, they're subjective. They may use empirical systems looking strictly on nature, the natural world, and they will look at these objective, empirical elements of society, and they emphasize those things rather than the inherent value of dignity that every human being has by virtue of who they are and what a human is. What kind of thing is a human? Made in the image of God. And regardless of economics, regardless of ethnicity, every human being should have dignity, and we should deal with injustices. But that's essentially where we find ourselves on intersectionality. So moving forward, we also see then that on intersectionality, justice is sociologically based on particular segments of society. Particular segments in whom we see that they experience discriminatory inequalities based on those. It is the claim, it is the experience, whether real or felt or historically accurate, it's immaterial. It is a justice based on where one is plotted in society. If I could say it in the most, common way, where you're plotted. Are you in the oppressive system or are you in the oppressed group? And the emphasis is not on the oppressors. The emphasis is on the oppressed. But on biblical ethics, justice, as it finds its essence as being an extension of who God is, it is a shareable, transcendent essence because it belongs to God first. And when He made us in His image and in His likeness. He shares attributes, essences that transcend who we are, but something we can share. So we're made in His likeness. We are not God, but we share the likeness. We share in his image. We are not the image of God, but we share in the image of God. It is something we can experience. It is something we can have. It is something we can do as well. Biblical ethics tells us that justice is in essence independent of the material world or immaterial or material realism. Let me explain a little more here. So, for the longest, the view of what the nature of, the constitution of what a human is has usually been around, we have a dual nature. We have a physical nature. It's the one we can touch. It's the one that has muscles. It is the one that smiles. It is the one we hug, the one we love. A physical nature. Allows us to interact in our physical world. And, when we try to break the laws of physics, if two things cannot occupy the same space at the same time, we know that. We know what that feels like. But we also have an immaterial element or aspect or essence of who we are in our dualistic nature. We have an immaterial part of us, the spirit, the soul. On biblical ethics or virtue ethics, justice is a part of that independent, immaterial world. It exists within a material world, but it is independent of it. So, justice is a virtue, and it is an essence. What's the difference between the two? Well, just to help us in a very popular kind of way, we can either do it or we can be it. When it is something we can share, it is something we can do, it's something we can be, then we have sort of worked through the virtue and the essence of it. So how does this impact our knowledge of biblical justice? Well, we have a few more things to point out here. One, it's really important to appreciate what the Bible tells us about this. One, we're made in the image of God. Genesis chapter 1, verses 26 and 27 tells us that, that God made mankind in his image and in his likeness, and he made us male and female. And because we're made in his image, we then have been blessed to bear that image. And that means justice then begins with this, or human justice begins with this communicable, the shareable blessing of his nature and his virtue. But at the same time, because we're free will beings, we must choose to be virtuous. We must choose to be just. We must choose to do justice, mercy, compassion, kindness. So being human gives us the ability to share this transcendent virtue, this transcendent aspect of our relationship to God by virtue of being created in his image. But we actually have to participate in this. It is not ours by default, at least not now after the fall. But we are capable of doing it and being just and being holy. Furthermore, this means that throughout the entire biblical teaching, we find, like in the stories of the Good Samaritan, we find stories in the stories of Jesus, how he loved his neighbor, cared for them, healed the sick, helped the poor, cast out demons, did miracles. All of these examples that we see in Luke chapter 4 and Luke chapter 5, we see Jesus doing good to all the people. We see that part of that is bringing light to those in darkness. We see that giving sight to the blind and letting the lame walk. And we see the early church, though equipped for some time with apostles who could do similar things, the fundamental work of the church is to do goodness, mercy, compassion, kindness. And here's a good, I think you'll appreciate this if you're really concerned of how biblical justice plays into this. And this is a little bit of Bible history. So when the New Testament was being composed, the letters come first. The letters were published first. Most of all the letters came before the Gospels were ever published as a book. Now think about this for a second. The letters really show that the church is supposed to love each other and care for people, and there's a lot of morality and virtue ethics about how to live and how to care for others. But later, around maybe the 50s and into the 60s, and maybe even a little later, like in the Gospel of John, the stories of Jesus are then put into written form for the early church to kind of have a permanent form of what Jesus looked like in terms of what he did, how he was virtuous, the kind of what we might call biblical social justice that he did. Unfortunately, the church has tried different models of social justice. In the late 1800s and early 1900s, really, there was this attempt to do something called the social gospel. And it was really designed to help and be a part of the betterment of mankind, to help men and mankind maybe learn a trade, have some sort of welfare system. But it was detached. It was detached from the gospel. In other words, you could be in a Christian ministry and care for people, and you never taught them to follow Jesus. And this became a popularized form of Christianity, the betterment of man, the brotherhood of mankind, and the essence of Christianity. And it really had a theological basis. That has been disastrous because you love people into the graves, but don't prepare them for heaven. Biblical justice, on the other hand, or caring for the neighbor, has much to do about showing compassion, being an asset to your neighborhood, being of support to those around you in need, whether in the church or out the church. You're not only doing that, but you're sharing Jesus and you're making it every bit gospel that Jesus showed us in his own life. So when I boil it down then, based on the distinctions between the modern the modern justice system that people are trying to do based on intersectionality, it is incompatible because it goes back to the same problem that it only focuses on people's social positions in society. It does not deal with what a human is, and it doesn't care, nor does it believe that such a thing as human dignity exists as a standard that is objective, that is an immaterial, shareable essence. Everything is just subjective. Biblical justice looks at the person as created in the image of God, seeing them in their need, seeing them in their fallen state, and then bringing them the compassion and love of Jesus and the love of God, doing God's work, but also following in the teaching of Jesus to help them so that they might learn to turn to Jesus and go and sin no more. And that's the difference. Thank you.